Welcome to Cooking the Books. I'm Frances Cook. You'd have to be living under a rock to miss all this chat about housing lately. What with the soaring prices and the government bringing in new rules to try to bring it all under control. While it's good that action is being taken on this front, it's always a long-term game. We'll have to wait to see how many of the housing changes actually impact us in reality, and there's usually a lag effect where even successful measures take a while to work. Now, while I do think that owning your own home is important for financial security, I strongly believe that it's not the only thing. And certainly when it comes to property investment, there are much more options for your money. In fact, even if you were to buy your own house and then stop there, I'd argue that you're not looking after your financial future properly. So if you're feeling frustrated by all of this, you do still have options. And it seems New Zealanders are already picking up on this. Hatch polled its investors and found 35% don't invest in property. 14% said they simply couldn't afford it. Meanwhile, another 14% are looking to invest more in shares soon. Now, to be clear, this was a Facebook poll, so not scientific, but it is backed up by a very credible survey carried out by the Financial Markets Authority, released at the end of last year. Their attitudes towards New Zealand's financial markets survey showed property investing was falling, down 5 percentage points to just 9% last year, while more people were buying shares, bouncing up to 20%. So what's behind all of this? How do you do it well?
Newstalk ZB presents Cooking the Books with Frances Cook.
I'm joined now by Kristen Lundman from Hatch. Now, you recently talked to some of the people in your investors club. I do want to be clear, it was obviously this most recent one was a Facebook poll, so not a scientific poll, but still speaks to a really interesting sentiment. You found far and away most of your investors aren't looking at property, quite a few saying it's just unaffordable. So run me through those results and what people are saying to you.
Cool. So I just put out a quick, again, it wasn't meant to be scientific, but I wanted to take the pulse of some of our investors. And is this going to change your investing behavior? Are you investing in property? Are you not? And actually, if you think about it, it's probably no surprise that the majority, I would wager, of investors on Hatch probably aren't in property investors, and it's because they are share market investors. And I think we've seen a really big split in New Zealand since the '89 crash. You had a huge generation of people that were burned by that crash, and as a result, they've turned to property. Enter property obsession. And so I came to New Zealand 10 years ago. And was really stunned at kind of this obsession in this market and the reliance upon it to build wealth. And really coming from Canada, where share market investing was the norm, it was something we opened up investing accounts coming out of uni with your first jobs. We recognized, what dividends were and why you would invest in a business and what to look for. And so I was, really surprised coming here. But I think what we've seen, tables are flipped. But again, I think in that share market investing is kind of on the rise, and that's fantastic for a number of reasons. We can chat about that. But yeah, look, I think it's probably no surprise that those have opted against property for a number of reasons. High barriers to entry, right from kind of getting the deposit, the faff of owning a rental property, an investment property, let alone getting in on your own property. Really hard, time consuming, very expensive. So share market investing is really low barrier to entry, high liquidity. I can get in and out where needed. So I think that's probably no surprise. Low levels of property investment. And the other thing was that those that did say that they were investing in property were actually considering, there was quite a large amount considering selling because it was no longer kind of as attractive as it has been historically, and putting that money into the share markets. So again, comfortable with the share markets and very much open to kind of doubling down in that area.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because I think you're spot on. There was, for a long time, this entrenched attitude in New Zealand that I would say the average person who might have been interested in how to handle their money wasn't looking at the share market. That was too hard basket. That was for rich people or special people or whatever. And my thought, and I'd love to know your thoughts on this a bit more, is obviously KiwiSaver came in, I think, 13 years ago now. And we've had platforms like yours that have come into existence pretty recently. And I think overseas they were around a lot earlier. Meanwhile, we've seen property absolutely take off and get really, really expensive in kind of the same time period. I feel like those factors are now hitting a tipping point. What about you? Do you think it's those factors, other ones?
Yeah, I think also it's like this globalization. Like we are literally, you open up Instagram, you open up Facebook, it's likely you're on some sort of forum and people are talking about shares. I think also the accessibility to well-known brands. And so while New Zealand, you might know someone that sits on the board of company A or company B, you might not use the products every day other than, I mean, the obvious, like Air New Zealand or the likes of, some of the brands that we do use every day. But I do think that the idea of investing in Facebook or, platform I might use every day, or iPhone, don't leave home without it, and actually be a shareholder in these companies that I intuitively understand, I think has probably just made it, well, it's effectively democratized it and kind of brought it down to, I can actually own a slice of this business. I'm seeing it talked about on social media. Obviously Robinhood has now been around for, oh gosh, were they 2013? So they've been around long enough. Yeah, so I mean, it doesn't take a lot to kind of get connected in with some social channel where someone is talking about shares. And so I think you're right. I think the KiwiSaver effect, people are only just realizing that their money is actually invested, because that's the thing. It's like, oh my goodness, my money is in the share market. So I am a share market investor, combined with, property. What other options are there? So you're right. It's kind of this perfect storm of things that have happened that's raised this consciousness of there's other options to build wealth.
Yeah. Well, that's a really good point, because that's the next thing I want to touch on. I mean, I'm quite active on social media. Some would say overactive. That's fine. Talking to often a lot of the listeners here, and I get this feedback all the time from people that they feel house prices are crazy. And a lot of real frustration from people that they feel they can't get financial security. And now, while I understand, obviously, buying your own home and property investment are different, and buying your own home is important for security, I would argue quite strongly that it's still not the only path to financial security. So if someone is interested in shares and building financial security through that instead, what are some good strategies for starting down that path?
So I would start, look, you want to work your way up, ideally, and I'm using kind of overseas standards here, 10 to 15% of your income. That feels scary. You don't have to start that, but just start to look at like the big ticket items in your life. And if you can kind of get those down, we're not talking about your daily coffees, but look at those big wins and those big ticket items. You could probably creep up to 10% of your income in time. And so certainly I think, look, if you're working up towards 10% of your income and you're investing that for a long period of time in the share market, over the period of, let's say, 25 years, if you can work your way up to, let's just say, $1,500 a month. I know that feels like a lot for those that are kind of beginning on their career pathway. But as you progress, if you can do that over a long period of time, you've effectively accumulated the average the average house price of a New Zealand house over the period of 25 years. Now, naturally, you don't have to start that, but you're right, there's those trade-offs. So basically by doing nothing, by looking at areas you can kind of free up a little bit more cash and put that into the share markets. And then you're just sitting and doing nothing. You're basically just letting time and businesses do their thing and grow and become more valuable and more productive. Your money's working for you while you're sleeping. There's no house maintenance, there's no repairs, there's no property taxes, and you're just kind of letting it go in the background. You can actually accumulate what's equivalent to effectively a average average house price in New Zealand. So very doable. And I know that $1,500 a month feels scary, but there's really great forums and movements out there, like the FIRE movement, for example, that gives so many great tips and tricks on how just you can get that kind of money together to invest. But even just starting, with $200 or $500 a month is a great start, and you just build your way up.
Oh, absolutely. And I think sometimes people get intimidated by it, right? I mean, honestly, even if you just start with $5 a week to just get used to it, but you can still, you can actually find that once you get started, I think people find it less intimidating than they expected. And they often find it, I don't really want to say fun, because I don't know that necessarily investing should be fun. You can fall down some bad rabbit holes that way. But, you can find it very rewarding quite quickly, and that can give you the motivation to make those cuts. And I do think that over time, that 10 to 15% of your income, it can be achievable. It definitely can. If you're wanting to make those changes, it can be done. And then, if you're using that in place of housing investment or owning your own home, I mean, how would that work when it comes to that 25, 30 years later? How would you use your little nest egg to give you that financial security?
Well, we know that historically, share markets have increased by 10% on average over a long period of time. That's both the New Zealand and the US share market. So historically, we know that they do tend to go up and down in the short term, but over the long run, don't forget the share markets is basically just a bunch of businesses. And over time, businesses grow and they become more valuable, and they become more productive, and they become more innovative, and that's reflected in the share price. So you can effectively make money in two ways with shares, and that's by dividends, where a company will pay you out some of their profits as a thank you for being a shareholder in their company. And the second way is by selling. If I bought Amazon 10 years ago, probably would have bought it at $75. Today it's $2,500. So I would have, if I were to sell my Amazon shares today, I would have all of that profit in the background. So in the future, look, I suppose that the key with investing is just to kind of go in mindfully and recognize what you're saving for. So with a house, I suppose it's happening in the background and you're becoming a house owner over time. So when you retire, you actually own the asset that you're living in. With share market investing, you just have to be really clear because of course it is liquid, you can sell. And so you've got to keep your emotions in check, and you have to really be clear what that bucket's for. Is that for retirement? We've got KiwiSaver, so make sure that you're in the right KiwiSaver fund. You're kind of maximizing your investment into KiwiSaver. It's a fantastic avenue. And then with the share markets, the same thing. I think it's a little bit more liquid. It's not locked like a KiwiSaver, so you have to be really clear. That's kind of for my kids' education fund. That's for my retirement. That's for a trip that I would like to do in 3 years' time. So I just think as long as you've got kind of those goals, you know that over time, share markets tend to increase in value over the long run.
And I also want to touch on, you did a fascinating, slightly more in-depth survey of your investors back in November, which threw up all sorts of very interesting results. One that really stood out to me is that the average Hatch investor, your investors, puts in about $2,000 a month. Now, were you surprised by that amount? Because that seems like a lot to me, particularly if those same people are saying they feel shut out of property.
I think a couple things were happening during the time of that. Now, we were obviously in the year of pandemic, and so we've come out of a lockdown, and a lot of Kiwis have changed their spending behaviors. I mean, you yourself and me, we're now working from home more often, and so some of our expenses are lower. We found that we can do without some things, and so I do think that not only have we kind of looked at, oh, I probably don't need to commute as much, or I might actually have changed some of my spending habits. I think that frees up. We talked about some of that real low-hanging fruit of amassing amounts of money. We know that after the lockdown, there's insane sales on house renovations and decking and hot tubs and all this money that we're no longer spending on traveling. And so, to be fair, at that moment in time, that probably wasn't a big surprise because we had more disposable income. Those, of course, that were lucky enough to to hold on to their jobs. Therefore, we were putting it to work because it was a really great time to do that. We've seen share markets, obviously rebound quite quickly after that crash a year ago, actually. So probably wasn't a surprise that people were kind of saying, this is now something I understand, and I'm going to start to commit some serious money, so that I can get life-changing wealth in the future.
I know, it's crazy, isn't it? This time a year ago, life was so different. We were mid-level 4, and it just feels like, how has this year been simultaneously a month long and 10 years long? My sense of time is out the window.
I know, it's April. It's April now, and I just think, what month are we again? Oh yeah, right. But it's great actually. I think it's been, look, it hasn't been great. Obviously, it's a terrible kind of thing that's happened, and those that have been impacted. It's obviously awful, but it has kind of made us rethink how we're living, how we're working. We're obviously connecting over video, which is something we might not have done a year ago. So I think there's been some really interesting lifestyle changes that we're making, and share market interest. I mean, that obviously skyrocketed during this time as well, which is also fantastic, because finally you've got a nation that's turning their eyes to other means, and well-known means that people around the world have been using for hundreds of years to grow their wealth, which is super cool.
Yeah. Well, this is one of the things, and this is why, even though I know I mentioned earlier about your initial poll being on Facebook, but it is backed up all over the place by all of these other polls that have been done. The FMA also released research on attitudes to investing. I mean, they release it all the time, but this one was November last year, and picked up on those same trends that you have, that property investing is reducing and that people are looking elsewhere to grow their money. And there was particularly this really strong spike in interest in shares during the lockdown after COVID-19. What do you think? I mean, for starters, what did you see in your user database through that time? But also, what do you think attracted people to shares at a time when it was actually looking really weird out there and there was so much uncertainty?
I know, but I think the uncertainty presents opportunity always, doesn't it? And so there's two answers I'll give to that. And the first is, I'm going to talk about the US movement and Robinhood, because I think there was a very clear kind of momentum that happened there and reasoning why, and then what we found with our investors here in New Zealand, which is actually quite different. So with Robinhood, they found enormous, I think they got 3 million signups over the course of a very short period of time. I mean, incredible growth on that platform. And it was largely with very young investors. And the reasons why were, this was a hypothesis, and actually it makes sense, is that sports were off. And all of these people that historically had been betting, gambling on sports, could no longer do it. We were in lockdown, we had more time on our hands. Therefore, that whole kind of Robinhood movement was on kind of bored people, locked down at home, couldn't kind of, get into that space. So they opened up Robinhood accounts. And so we saw kind of this massive growth there. Knock-on effect here, again, we're in a globalized world. Like, we can kind of get a sense of what's happening overseas now very easily, and tend to mimic that behavior. Now, what we found here was different. These weren't people that are sports betting and all of a sudden wanting to get into the share markets. They did have time on their hands. So there was this real push to, oh my goodness, we're in this weird state now where we've actually got a little bit of disposable time. What am I going to do with it? There were people that were taking online courses. We had a Hatch Getting Started course. People were kind of, if I maybe want to learn about investing. And so I think we saw maybe 10,000 people over that lockdown period go through this Getting Started course with the share markets, which was great. So I think it was time on hands to learn something new. The other thing, and this is something that we kind of promoted quite a bit, was this is potentially our global financial crisis moment. We know that in 2008, the share markets crashed and a number of people didn't get in. All you have to do is look back to what the share markets did in 2008 to now and see that, oh my goodness, I've missed out on all of those gains had I just kind of gone and invested. And what it felt like was this massive crash. Was this our global financial crisis moment? And if I trust that all these companies, are going to recover. The world is going to recover. This is a great time to get off the sidelines and into the market. And that's exactly what happened. And within 4 months, we saw the share markets recover back to kind of pre-pandemic levels. So, people did very well kind of getting in at the bottom there and getting off the sidelines. So I think, again, it was a little bit of time to kind of educate ourselves. We had more money on our hands to put to work for us. And then I think, it was like, oh, well, if we're thinking that investing is investing in businesses and they're all at all-time lows, it might be a quality business on sale. And so why wouldn't I get in now? And that's what we saw thousands and thousands do. So to answer your question about Hatch, obviously saw enormous growth through that period. We had to kind of hire 10 people during lockdown, which I think was unheard of, just to kind of keep up with some of the customer inquiries and interest, which was great. So it was a pretty intense time.
No, I can imagine. I saw some of the numbers coming out because obviously the FMA was tracking this as well. And I can't remember the full figures off the top of my head, but it was a boom of tens of thousands of people who were more interested in the share market, and not just interested, were actually taking steps to get into it, which, I mean, I think that's fabulous. I love the idea of people investing. It does freak me out that we have so many new people coming in all at once. And I mean, we're still in slightly uncertain, slightly volatile times with the markets going up and down. And we're not entirely sure what's coming in the next few months. So, I mean, with things like you've got the Hatch Getting Started course, we've seen a big push for platforms to be helping their users, not just to use the share market, but to be educated about it. So when you're talking to these new people and helping them figure it out, what are some of the things that you like to emphasize? What are tips for getting going?
So the first thing is just forget about doing everything right and just avoid the biggest mistakes. Because with investing, sometimes you're going to not get it right, 100% right, particularly if you're picking individual companies. So great way to start is just to start with a company you know really well, and probably put in a small amount and get comfortable with some of the fluctuations like you talked about. The second is you could start with an exchange traded fund and just spread your money over hundreds of companies at one go. So you could start with a really kind of broad fund, like a US 500 fund that spreads your money across the 500 biggest companies in the States. So just start with, keep it real simple, and then just avoid some of the biggest mistakes. So biggest mistakes would be kind of reacting to some of the big drops. If you wake up and your portfolio has dropped, and so all of a sudden you're like down money, you actually don't realize those losses if you don't sell. So just panic selling is probably a really big mistake. That's something to avoid. Another one is trying to time the market, and this is like, ooh, I'm not going to get in yet because what if something happens next week, or I know blah blah blah, we're waiting for the big market crash. What happens is that humans can't time the market. You're better actually just to kind of get in and ride out those bumps. And maybe the share markets are going to drop next week, but we know over the long period they're going to go up. So no panic selling, don't time the market. Hype would be the next thing. Like if you hear a really hot stock tip, and it's already across social media, it's probably too late. And so that's, you're probably going to buy at the peak, because as people jump into a share, the share price is going to go up. And then, of course, if it has nothing related to that company and it's just hype, it's going to correct at some point. So stay away from hype. So what ends up being is all of a sudden I'm like, emotions don't drive me. I've just got to get in and kind of let it sit out, and I'm not getting in on hype trading. Investing is kind of a little bit boring, and it probably should be. Like, it's actually okay. Just invest in really exciting companies and give them time to grow, or just spread your money across funds and just give it time to grow. And so it shouldn't be fun. It should be a little bit boring, but it should also be really empowering and exciting, as you said, just like, oh, I'm like building this thing and taking control kind of my finances, which is really cool. So just avoid the big mistakes, don't overcomplicate it, and just get started. Would be how I would approach kind of someone starting. And day trading, that's I suppose buying and selling. I think less than 1% of day traders actually tend to beat the market over the long period. They might make a quick win here, a quick win there, and they tell all their friends about it, but they certainly don't tell you when they make a loss and they actually have gone the other way. So day trading is a bad idea. So Hatch, the platform, we don't actually even allow day trading. It's just not something that we know it's not good for long-term wealth building, and so it's not something we promote. So your fees can add up really quickly and wipe out kind of any of those gains anyway. So again, just avoid the real bad mistakes and just make it kind of boring. But what the exciting part again is just being a shareholder in some awesome companies.
Yeah, I love that idea of just avoid the big mistakes and the rest of it is fine. Because I mean, I am certainly someone who has, I wouldn't say I've ever made a big mistake, but I've certainly done things that I look back and went, I kind of wish I did that differently, or I wish I invested in this and not that, or whatever. And I just think there's always what I like to think of as non-fatal learning opportunities.
Yes.
As long as you're still ticking along, you're doing fine. There's always going to be times when you maybe missed the boat, or you could have done better, or if you'd waited a week. But like you say, especially that thing of timing the market, I've seen so much research on that people who wait until the perfect time, waiting for that dip so they can buy in cheap and then hopefully sell when it's really expensive. People are so bad at that. We are really, really, really bad. And even if you actually do get it right, and you do manage to wait and buy when it's cheap, most people, that time that you missed on being in the market waiting for that dip, you would have made more money than what you've made hitting that dip perfectly. So yeah, those standard golden rules, and then not worrying about the details, I feel like that's really important, right? Because there'll always be details that you wish you'd done differently.
Yeah, exactly. And I think probably a key tip is to kind of think of the most of your investment portfolio. This is kind of a common approach, should be spread across hundreds of companies in funds, because that's kind of the stuff that, and Warren Buffett, the kind of most successful investor of all time, has kind of said that, just spread your money across hundreds of companies in a couple funds, and then you can kind of start to play around the edges of that, and play, not using the right term, but what are some companies that you know really well and you kind of back to grow, the pioneers of tomorrow, might be an industry like space or green energy or something like that. Those are the things around the edges that you can start to really kind of express yourself, and kind of back what you believe in those areas. As well. So that's another way to make it kind of pretty easy, is just to kind of let the kind of these fund managers do the work for you.
100%. Hey, thank you so much. That's Kristen Lundman from Hatch. Now, you might have questions about this or any other money topic. Been getting lots of questions lately, cramming in as many of them as I can. If you've got more, get in touch. You can find me on Facebook, Frances Cook Journalist, Twitter, Frances Cook, Instagram, Frances Cook NZ, and I'll try to get them answered for you in a future podcast. You can also subscribe to Cooking the Books pretty much everywhere you find podcasts, including iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Until next time, have a great day.